One sunny Saturday morning, Sarah decided it was finally time to tackle the clutter in her garage. It had been months since she'd last opened the door all the way, and she knew there were boxes, tools, and old sports equipment piled up inside that needed sorting. Armed with a cup of coffee and a playlist of upbeat music, she rolled up the garage door, letting sunlight flood the space. The air smelled faintly of dust and forgotten things, but Sarah didn't mind. She loved the satisfaction of organizing and rediscovering items she hadn't seen in years. As she began moving things around, something unusual caught her eye. Tucked away in the far corner of the garage, partially hidden under a dusty tarp, were two objects that definitely didn't belong to her. At first glance, they looked like bicycles, but as she pulled the tarp off, she realized they weren't ordinary bikes. They were dirt bikes. Sarah frowned, confused. She didn't own dirt bikes, nor did anyone in her immediate family. Where had these come from? And how had they ended up in her garage without her noticing? Curiosity quickly turned to suspicion when she noticed a decal on one of the bikes. It read Ethan Wilson in bold letters. Ethan Wilson, Karen's teenage son. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle started coming together in Sarah's mind. Ethan was known around the neighborhood for his love of loud, fast vehicles, much to the annoyance of many residents, especially Karen herself. The HOA had strict rules about noise disturbances, and dirt bikes were explicitly prohibited. Could it be possible that Karen, in an effort to avoid trouble, had sneaked into Sarah's garage and stashed the bikes there? Sarah stood frozen for a moment, staring at the bikes as if they might explain themselves. Her initial confusion gave way to anger. How dare Karen use her property as a hiding spot without even asking? What made Karen think she could just barge into Sarah's life like this? Sarah felt violated, as though her personal space had been invaded. But beyond the anger, there was also a sense of betrayal. Despite their polite interactions, Karen clearly didn't respect Sarah enough to treat her as an equal neighbor. Determined to get answers, Sarah snapped a few photos of the bikes with her phone before covering them back up. She wanted proof in case Karen tried to deny anything later. As she closed the garage door and headed back inside, her mind raced with questions. Why would Karen do something so sneaky? Did she really think Sarah wouldn't find out? And most importantly, what was Sarah supposed to do now? The discovery left Sarah feeling uneasy, like she'd stumbled onto something she wasn't meant to see. For the rest, suggest changes or improvements. Please let me know how you'd like to proceed. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where houses lined the streets like rows of perfect little boxes, Sarah Thompson lived a simple and peaceful life. Her home was modest but cozy, with flower beds that bloomed in vibrant colors every spring. She wasn't one for drama or gossip. Instead, she preferred tending to her garden, reading books on lazy afternoons, and occasionally chatting with neighbors who shared her laid-back vibe. To most people, Sarah seemed like the kind of person you'd barely notice, quiet, dependable, and unassuming. But not everyone saw her that way. Across the street lived Karen Wilson, a woman whose personality couldn't be more different from Sarah's. If Sarah was calm waters, Karen was a storm. Known throughout the neighborhood as the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, HOA, Karen prided herself on making sure everyone followed the rules, even if it meant micromanaging their lives. Whether it was reminding someone to mow their lawn or sending passive-aggressive notes about holiday lights left up past January, Karen always found something to criticize. Some neighbors joked that she carried a clipboard everywhere she went, ready to jot down any infraction. Despite their differences, Sarah and Karen had managed to maintain a polite relationship, or at least that's what Sarah told herself. They exchanged pleasantries when they crossed paths, though Sarah couldn't help but feel uneasy around Karen. There was something about the way Karen looked at her sometimes, a flicker of disapproval behind her forced smile, that made Sarah wonder if she'd done something wrong. Maybe it was because Sarah didn't attend every HOA meeting. Or maybe it was because her garden, while beautiful, didn't have the perfectly manicured edges Karen seemed to favor. Whatever the reason, Sarah tried not to let it bother her too much. Still, living next to someone like Karen wasn't easy. The HOA rules were strict, covering everything from mailbox colors to the height of hedges. While some residents appreciated the structure, others felt suffocated by it. Sarah fell somewhere in between. She understood the importance of keeping the neighborhood tidy, but she also valued her privacy and independence. Over time, she learned to pick her battles, choosing to focus on her own slice of happiness rather than getting caught up in Karen's endless crusade for perfection. What Sarah didn't realize, however, was that Karen's watchful eye had been on her for longer than she thought. Beneath the surface of their seemingly cordial relationship lay a simmering tension, one that would soon boil over in ways neither of them could have predicted. For now, though, Sarah remained blissfully unaware, content to live her quiet life and enjoy the small joys that came with it. Little did she know, trouble was lurking just around the corner, waiting to disrupt the peace she cherished so deeply. With her mind made up, Sarah crossed the street later that afternoon, determined to confront Karen about the dirt bikes. She knocked firmly on Karen's front door, gripping her phone tightly in her hand. The photos of the bikes were ready if Karen tried to deny anything. Moments later, the door swung open, and there stood Karen, wearing her usual crisp outfit and a smile that seemed just a little too practiced. "Hi, Sarah," Karen said, her tone overly sweet. "What brings you over today?" Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I found something in my garage this morning," she began, watching Karen's expression carefully. "Two dirt bikes. They're Ethan's, aren't they?" For a split second, Karen's confident demeanor faltered. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly recovered, plastering on a look of innocent confusion. "Dirt bikes? In your garage? That's strange. I have no idea how they got there." Sarah wasn't buying it. "They have Ethan's name on them, Karen, and let's be honest, you're the only person who'd think hiding them in someone else's garage was a good idea." Karen hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Sarah's directness. For a moment, Sarah thought Karen might admit the truth, but instead, the older woman's lips curled into a smug grin. It was the kind of smile that made Sarah's blood boil, a mixture of arrogance and superiority. "Well," Karen said slowly, crossing her arms, "maybe you should consider this a favor. You know how strict the HOA is about noise complaints. If anyone found out Ethan had those bikes, it could have caused problems for all of us. I was just keeping them out of sight until things cooled down." Sarah stared at her, stunned. "So you broke into my garage without permission and hid them there, without even asking me first?" Karen waved a dismissive hand, as though Sarah's outrage was completely unreasonable. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's not like you were using that corner anyway. And honestly, Sarah, you should be thanking me. If the HOA inspectors had come by and seen those bikes sitting in your driveway, you'd have been the one in trouble, not me." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Not only had Karen violated her privacy, but she also had the audacity to act like Sarah should feel grateful. The nerve of this woman was unbelievable. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help. She needed to handle this situation rationally. "You can't just do whatever you want, Karen," Sarah said firmly. "This is my property, and you had no right to put anything there without asking. What if something had happened to the bikes while they were in my garage? Would you have blamed me for that too?" Karen rolled her eyes, clearly uninterested in Sarah's point of view. "Relax, Sarah. Nothing happened to them. And besides, nobody even knows they're there except for you and me. Just keep quiet about it, and we'll both be fine." The way Karen spoke to her, as if Sarah's feelings and boundaries didn't matter, made her stomach churn. This wasn't just about the bikes anymore. It was about respect. Sarah realized then that Karen saw her as someone who would simply go along with whatever she wanted, someone too timid to push back. But Sarah wasn't going to let Karen walk all over her. As she turned to leave, she shot Karen a sharp look. "We're not done talking about this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Walking back home, Sarah replayed the conversation in her head. Karen's attitude had only fueled her frustration. She knew she couldn't let this slide, not after being treated so disrespectfully. Something had to give, and Sarah was starting to think drastic measures might be the only way to make Karen understand the seriousness of what she'd done. Back in the quiet solitude of her home, Sarah paced around the living room, replaying every word of her confrontation with Karen. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. How could Karen act so entitled? Hiding Ethan's dirt bikes in Sarah's garage without permission was bad enough, but the way Karen brushed it off like it was no big deal made Sarah's blood boil. It wasn't just about the invasion of her space. It was the sheer audacity of Karen thinking she could manipulate Sarah into going along with her schemes. Sarah sank onto the couch, her mind racing. She'd always been someone who preferred to avoid conflict, choosing peace over drama whenever possible. But this felt different. This wasn't a minor disagreement or a simple misunderstanding. This was a deliberate violation of her boundaries. And worse, Karen didn't seem to care. In fact, she acted as though Sarah should feel lucky to have been used as a pawn in her game. That smug grin of hers kept flashing in Sarah's mind, fueling her frustration even further. As the hours ticked by, an idea began to form. A bold, risky plan that would send a clear message to Karen. What if Sarah turned the tables on her? If Karen thought she could dump her problems in Sarah's lap, then Sarah would make sure those problems became impossible to ignore. By the time evening fell, Sarah had made up her mind. She would destroy the dirt bikes and leave the pieces right where Karen couldn't miss them. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about standing up for herself. For years, Sarah had let people like Karen push her around, assuming that staying quiet would keep the peace. But now she realized that silence only encouraged people like Karen to take advantage of her kindness. This time, Sarah decided, things would be different. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't apologize. She would show Karen exactly what happened when you crossed her. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a mix of nerves and determination. Her heart pounded as she considered the enormity of what she was about to do. Destroying property, no matter whose it was, wasn't something she ever imagined herself doing. But this wasn't just any situation. This was about taking control, about reclaiming her power after being treated like a doormat. As she sipped her coffee and stared out the window at Karen's house across the street, Sarah reminded herself why she was doing this. She wasn't proud of the decision, but she knew it was necessary. Later that day, Sarah borrowed a sledgehammer from a neighbor under the pretense of breaking down some old furniture. When she returned home, she took a deep breath and stepped into the garage. The dirt bikes sat there silently, mocking her with their presence. Sarah hesitated for a moment, gripping the handle of the sledgehammer tightly. Could she really go through with this? Would Karen retaliate? The questions swirled in her mind, but Sarah pushed them aside. She had come too far to turn back now. With one final glance at the bikes, Sarah swung the sledgehammer for the first time. The sound of metal crunching echoed through the garage, startling her, but also giving her a strange sense of satisfaction. Each swing brought a mix of emotions: anger, relief, disbelief. She never imagined herself capable of such calculated destruction, but as the bikes twisted and crumpled beneath her blows, Sarah felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. This wasn't just about the bikes anymore. It was about proving to Karen, to herself, and to everyone else that she wouldn't be walked all over anymore. By the time she finished, sweat dripped from her forehead, and the once pristine dirt bikes were reduced to mangled pieces of scrap. Exhausted but resolute, Sarah loaded the wreckage into her car. Under the cover of dusk, she drove across the street and dumped the remains in Karen's driveway, leaving behind a note that read, "Thanks for storing these here. Enjoy cleaning them up." As she walked back home, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: Karen would never see her the same way again. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a subtle but noticeable transformation. The incident with the dirt bikes had become more than just a personal feud between Sarah and Karen. It had ignited a spark of change within the community. People who had once kept their heads down, avoiding conflict at all costs, began to find their voices. Conversations that used to center around trivial complaints now shifted toward larger issues: fairness, accountability, and respect. Karen, for her part, tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. She doubled down on enforcing HOA rules, issuing warnings for minor infractions like overgrown hedges or mismatched house numbers. But instead of instilling fear, her efforts only fueled resentment. Neighbors started sharing stories about how Karen had singled them out in the past, how she'd nitpicked their holiday decorations or reported them for parking violations. These whispered grievances soon turned into open discussions, and before long, Karen's reputation as the queen of the HOA was tarnished beyond repair. Sarah found herself at the center of this growing movement, though she hadn't asked for the role. Residents began approaching her not just to express support, but to seek advice on how to handle Karen's antics. At first, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention, unsure if she was the right person to lead such an effort. But as she listened to their concerns, she realized something important. Standing up to Karen wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a better environment for everyone. Encouraged by the newfound unity among her neighbors, Sarah decided to take things a step further. She proposed organizing a casual meeting outside of the official HOA gatherings, a chance for residents to share their thoughts without fear of judgment or retaliation. To her surprise, nearly 24 people showed up to the first gathering, held in Mrs. Alvarez's backyard. They brought folding chairs, snacks, and plenty of opinions, eager to discuss ways to improve the neighborhood. The meetings quickly became a regular occurrence, giving residents a platform to voice their ideas and concerns. Some suggested revising outdated HOA rules, while others advocated for more social events to strengthen community bonds. Slowly but surely, the power dynamic began to shift. Where once Karen's word had been law, decisions were now made collectively, with input from everyone involved. Karen, of course, refused to acknowledge the changes happening around her. She continued to attend official HOA meetings, insisting that she was still in charge. But her influence was fading fast. Even members of the HOA board, who had previously backed her unconditionally, started questioning her motives. One particularly tense meeting ended with a motion to rotate leadership roles more frequently, a polite but clear signal that Karen's days as the undisputed leader were numbered. Despite the progress, tensions between Sarah and Karen remained high. Karen made no secret of her disdain for Sarah, often glaring at her during meetings or making snide comments under her breath. But Sarah refused to engage. She knew that responding to Karen's provocations would only give her the satisfaction of dragging her back into old patterns. Instead, Sarah focused on the positive changes taking place in the neighborhood, finding joy in the camaraderie she shared with her fellow residents. One evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset, she reflected on how far things had come. Just months ago, she had been content living quietly, avoiding confrontation at all costs. Now she was part of a movement, a force for good that had inspired others to stand up for themselves. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when she questioned whether it was worth it. But seeing the smiles on her neighbors' faces, hearing their laughter during gatherings, and feeling the sense of belonging that had grown stronger with each passing day made it all worthwhile. As she sipped her tea and listened to the distant chirping of crickets, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she had played a role in making things better. And though Karen's icy stares still lingered across the street, they no longer carried the weight they once did. Sarah had faced her fears, stood her ground, and emerged stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood continued to evolve in ways Sarah could never have imagined. The once strict and intimidating atmosphere enforced by Karen had given way to something warmer, more collaborative. Neighbors who barely knew each other's names before were now exchanging friendly waves, organizing block parties, and even helping one another with home repairs. It was as though the entire community had taken a collective deep breath, finally free from the suffocating grip of fear that Karen's micromanagement had created. Karen, for her part, struggled to adjust to her diminished role. She still attended HOA meetings, but her voice no longer carried the same weight it once did. When she tried to enforce rules or criticize others, her words often fell flat, met with polite indifference or gentle pushback. Some neighbors went out of their way to avoid engaging with her altogether, while others treated her with a level of detachment that bordered on coldness. Though Karen attempted to maintain her usual air of superiority, there were moments when Sarah caught glimpses of vulnerability in her expression, a flicker of sadness, perhaps even regret. Despite everything, Sarah didn't harbor any ill will toward Karen. In fact, she felt a strange sense of pity for her. For years, Karen had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, convinced that control equaled respect. But now, stripped of her authority, she seemed lost, unsure of how to fit into this new, more inclusive version of the community. Sarah realized that Karen's behavior hadn't been born out of malice so much as insecurity, a desperate need to feel important and in charge. That realization softened Sarah's feelings toward her, though it didn't change the fact that Karen needed to learn to adapt if she wanted to repair her relationships with the people around her. For Sarah, life had taken on a richness she hadn't experienced in years. She found herself volunteering for initiatives aimed at improving the neighborhood, from planting trees along the streets to organizing weekend cleanup events. Her confidence grew with each passing day, fueled by the knowledge that she had stood up not just for herself, but for the values she believed in: fairness, kindness, and mutual respect. The timid woman who had once avoided conflict at all costs was gone, replaced by someone bolder, stronger, and more self-assured. One crisp autumn morning, as Sarah watered her garden, she noticed Karen walking down the street. At first, she tensed slightly, expecting another confrontation. But instead of storming over to accuse her of something, Karen hesitated near Sarah's driveway, looking awkward and unsure. After a moment, she cleared her throat and said, "Thanks for helping Ethan get his learner's permit." Sarah blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Well," Karen muttered, avoiding eye contact, "you know how he got caught riding those dirt bikes without permission. He had to take a safety course afterward. And now he's actually being more responsible about things. I guess maybe some good came out of all this." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close enough. Sarah nodded slowly, offering Karen a small smile. "I'm glad to hear that. Everyone makes mistakes. It's how we grow from them that matters." Karen gave her a curt nod, then hurried away, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange. But as Sarah watched her go, she felt a pang of hope. Maybe Karen was starting to see the world, and her place in it, a little differently. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward counted. By the end of the year, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. The HOA meetings were shorter, less contentious, and far more productive. Residents worked together to create solutions rather than policing one another relentlessly. Even Karen began to soften, attending gatherings she would have dismissed in the past and occasionally joining in conversations with neighbors. For Sarah, the journey had been transformative. What started as a personal stand against injustice had blossomed into something much greater, a reminder that courage and resilience could inspire change, not just for oneself, but for an entire community. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching children play and adults chat under the golden glow of streetlights, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was what she'd always wanted, a neighborhood where everyone belonged, where kindness mattered more than rules, and where standing up for yourself didn't mean standing alone. The next morning, Sarah woke up earlier than usual, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and nerves. She peeked out her window, half expecting to see Karen already storming toward her house. But the street was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of sunrise. For a moment, she wondered if Karen had even noticed the mangled remains of the dirt bikes yet. Maybe she'd slept through the chaos, or maybe she hadn't stepped outside at all. But it didn't take long for the calm to shatter. By 8 a.m., Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice slicing through the stillness of the neighborhood. It started as a sharp gasp, followed by an escalating crescendo of outrage. "What is this?" Karen shrieked, her voice carrying across the street like a foghorn. Sarah moved closer to her window, careful not to be seen, and watched as Karen stomped around her driveway, staring in disbelief at the wreckage. The scene was almost comical. There, scattered across Karen's meticulously manicured driveway, were the twisted, broken pieces of Ethan's dirt bikes. Metal frames bent at odd angles, tires shredded, and handlebars snapped in two. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a modern art installation gone horribly wrong. And right in the middle of the mess lay Sarah's note, fluttering gently in the morning breeze. Karen snatched it up, her face turning redder with each word she read. Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction as she watched Karen's reaction from afar. The woman who always seemed so composed, so in control, was now unraveling completely. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their porches, while others gathered near Karen's driveway, whispering among themselves. A few even pulled out their phones to snap pictures of the destruction. It wasn't every day you saw something like this in their otherwise orderly neighborhood. Karen, realizing she had an audience, immediately launched into damage control mode. "This is outrageous," she declared, waving the crumpled note in the air like a flag of war. "Someone did this deliberately. They broke into my property and destroyed my son's bikes." Her dramatic tone only added to the spectacle. One neighbor raised an eyebrow. "Looks like whoever did it left you a message," he said dryly, nodding toward the note clutched in Karen's hand. Another chimed in. "Yeah, seems pretty personal. Any idea who might have done it?" Karen hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to deflect blame and needing to explain herself. Finally, she blurted out, "It's Sarah. It has to be her. She must have found out about the bikes being in her garage and decided to vandalize them." At that moment, Sarah stepped onto her porch, pretending to have just noticed the crowd gathering across the street. She walked casually down her driveway, feigning curiosity. "What's going on over there?" she asked innocently, loud enough for everyone, including Karen, to hear. Karen spun around, pointing an accusatory finger at Sarah. "You know exactly what's going on. You did this, didn't you? You destroyed Ethan's bikes and dumped them here like trash." Sarah crossed her arms, putting on her best poker face. "Me? Why would I do that? Last I checked, those bikes weren't mine. Sounds like someone else put them in my garage without asking, and then they mysteriously ended up back in your driveway." The subtle jab hit its mark. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, unable to respond. She couldn't admit to hiding the bikes in Sarah's garage without revealing her own wrongdoing. Instead, she sputtered, "That doesn't change the fact that you're responsible for this. Look at the state of these bikes. Someone clearly took a hammer to them." Sarah shrugged nonchalantly, letting her indifference speak for itself. "I don't know anything about that. Maybe they got damaged somehow during storage. All I did was return what belongs to you." "Seems fair, doesn't it?" The crowd murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. Karen's credibility was starting to crack under the weight of her own hypocrisy. No one could deny that she had a habit of bending rules when it suited her. And now, it seemed, karma had come knocking at her door. As Sarah turned to walk back inside, she caught Karen glaring daggers at her. But instead of feeling intimidated, Sarah felt a quiet sense of triumph. She had taken a stand, and whether or not anyone believed her version of events, one thing was clear. Karen's days of throwing her weight around unchecked were numbered. Karen's outbursts that morning became the talk of the neighborhood for days. The mangled dirt bikes, still sitting in her driveway like a monument to chaos, served as a constant reminder of the drama that had unfolded. Neighbors whispered about it during their morning walks, at the grocery store, and even at the local coffee shop. Opinions were divided, with some siding firmly with Karen and others quietly rooting for Sarah. For Karen, the situation was unbearable. She prided herself on being the picture of perfection, always put together, always in control. But now, her carefully constructed image was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Every time she stepped outside, she could feel the weight of judgmental stares and hushed conversations. People who once feared crossing her now seemed emboldened, exchanging knowing looks whenever she passed by. Even Ethan, her teenage son, complained bitterly about his ruined bikes, blaming her for getting him into trouble in the first place. Determined to reclaim her authority, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived armed with a stack of papers and a fiery speech prepared. As residents filed into the community center, they couldn't help but notice Karen pacing near the front of the room, her face flushed with determination. When the meeting began, she wasted no time addressing the incident. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable," Karen announced, her voice sharp and commanding. She held up Sarah's note, which she had laminated for dramatic effect. "Someone in this neighborhood took it upon themselves to destroy private property and dump it on my driveway. This isn't just vandalism. It's an attack on our community values." A few people nodded along, but many others remained silent, avoiding eye contact. One brave neighbor, Mr. Peterson, raised his hand cautiously. "With all due respect, Karen," he said, "didn't you admit that those bikes were hidden in someone else's garage without permission? Isn't that against the rules too?" The room fell silent. Karen's jaw tightened as she realized she'd walked right into a trap. Admitting to hiding the bikes would mean confessing to breaking HOA regulations herself. Instead, she stammered, "That's beside the point. Whether or not I made a mistake has nothing to do with what happened to the bikes. Vandalism is vandalism, and we need to address it." Her defensiveness only fueled more skepticism among the attendees. Another neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, chimed in. "It sounds like this whole thing started because of poor communication. Maybe if we focused on resolving conflicts peacefully instead of pointing fingers, we wouldn't have these problems." Karen shot her a glare but didn't respond. She knew she was losing ground. The more people questioned her actions, the weaker her position became. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that her attempt to rally support had backfired spectacularly. Instead of rallying behind her, many neighbors left the room shaking their heads, muttering about how Karen always seemed to make everything about herself. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself unexpectedly gaining allies. Several residents approached her after the meeting to express their admiration for standing up to Karen. "Honestly, I've been waiting for someone to do something like that for years," one woman confessed. "She's been running roughshod over everyone for too long." Sarah was surprised by the outpouring of support. She hadn't anticipated becoming a symbol of resistance against Karen's reign, but she welcomed the solidarity. For the first time in a long while, she felt empowered, not just to defend herself, but to advocate for fairness within the community. Still, Karen wasn't ready to let go of her grudge. Over the following weeks, she made subtle attempts to retaliate. She left passive-aggressive notes on Sarah's mailbox about minor infractions, like a stray weed poking through the sidewalk crack. But Sarah simply smiled each time she read them, knowing full well that Karen's bark was far worse than her bite. As tensions simmered, Sarah began noticing small changes in the neighborhood dynamic. More people started speaking up at HOA meetings, challenging Karen's decisions, and pushing for transparency. Slowly but surely, Karen's influence began to wane. What had started as a personal feud between two neighbors was transforming into something bigger, a collective pushback against bullying and favoritism. For Sarah, it was both exhilarating and humbling. She hadn't set out to spark a revolution, but she couldn't deny the impact her actions had made. And though Karen continued to glare at her from across the street, Sarah knew deep down that she'd won. not just against Karen, but against the fear that had held her back for so long.